When I look back, it's hard to pinpoint the exact moment things began to go wrong. Sometimes I wonder if the danger was always there, hidden beneath polished shoes, practiced smiles, and verses spoken in a velvet voice. What I know for sure is that it all began with the church. New Light Baptist Church was more than just a building. It was the beating heart of our small Georgia town. Sundays were sacred. No matter how hard the week had been, how empty the fridge was, or how heavy, my father's steps felt on his way home from the mill. Sunday was the day everything reset. It was when we dressed in our cleanest clothes, even if they were the same ones every week, and went to meet God. And at the center of it all stood Pastor Elijah Brooks. He was everything people wanted a man of God to be. Tall, confident, with smooth, dark skin that always seemed to glow under the pulpit lights. He spoke with fire, but his voice was gentle. You could sit through a sermon and feel like he had been reading your soul the entire time. The congregation loved him. My mother admired him deeply, maybe too deeply. She would often talk about how blessed we were to have such a spiritual leader, how he brought the Spirit into the room like no one else ever had. To the adults, Pastor Elijah was a gift from heaven. To us children, he was both fascinating and mysterious. He had a way of making us feel seen. He'd remember our names, ask how we were doing in school, pat us on the back, or ruffle our hair. At the time, it felt like attention. I didn't understand then how attention can sometimes come wrapped in danger. I was just 11. A quiet boy who loved books more than football, who stayed close to my mother's side and rarely spoke unless spoken to. When Pastor Elijah began to take an interest in me, my parents were overjoyed. "You must be doing something right," my mom said once, straightening my collar before service. "The Lord works through Pastor Elijah. If he sees something in you, it means you're special." Special. That word stayed with me. It made me feel proud, but also unsure. Because the way Pastor Elijah looked at me when no one was watching didn't feel like how a pastor should look at a child. He would find reasons to single me out. During youth events, he'd call me to sit near him. After service, he'd put his hand on my shoulder and keep it there just a little too long. He started asking my parents if he could mentor me, help shape my spiritual journey. He said I had potential, that God had a plan for my life. At first, I believed him. I was a child raised to trust adults, especially men in suits with Bibles in their hands. But over time, things felt different. Heavy, like I was always walking a step too close to the edge of something I couldn't name. He began inviting me into his office after service. He said he wanted to pray with me, talk to me about Scripture, help me grow. He'd lock the door behind him, always. He said it was to keep us from being interrupted. That prayer required silence. I didn't tell anyone. Not at first. I thought maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe this was what mentorship looked like, and I just didn't understand it yet. But I knew something wasn't right. My body knew before my mind did. I'd feel sick before church, find excuses to avoid youth group, fake stomach aches. My mother never caught on. My father watched quietly, his eyes following me from across the table, but he said nothing. Not yet. Back then, I didn't have the language to explain what I felt. I just knew that the church no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. And the man we all trusted, the one who spoke of light and salvation, had become the source of a darkness that followed me even in daylight. There's a strange kind of silence that settles over a child when they feel unsafe, but can't explain why. That silence lived inside me for months. It clung to my skin like a shadow I couldn't shake. Every Sunday felt heavier than the last. I began to dread the sound of gospel music, the scent of old pews, the sight of Pastor Elijah's smile. But I still went, because I was a child, and children don't get to choose what they run from. I kept quiet, and the world kept spinning. Pastor Elijah's attention didn't fade. It intensified. He'd pull me aside after service, resting his hand too low on my back. He started texting my mother, asking if I could help him with things at the church, organizing youth materials, folding bulletins, cleaning up after choir practice. She always said yes, proud that I was so responsible, proud that the pastor saw leadership in me. What she didn't see was the look in his eyes when no one else was around. What she didn't hear was how often he said my name, like it was his to claim. One Wednesday night after Bible study, he asked me to stay behind. My parents were in the fellowship hall helping clean up, and I knew they wouldn't notice if I was a little late. His office was dark except for the lamp on his desk, casting a gold glow across the room. He closed the door. I remember the sound of the latch clicking. I remember the way my stomach turned. He told me I was growing into a fine young man. He said God had placed a special light inside me. Then he reached out, brushed lint from my shoulder, and let his fingers linger a little too long. I froze. I couldn't speak. Something about his tone, his posture, the way he looked at me. It made my skin crawl. But I didn't run. I didn't know how to. I just stood there, heart pounding, waiting for it to end. That night, when we got home, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the paint with my eyes. My heart was loud in my ears. I wanted to tell someone. My mother, maybe. But the words wouldn't form. I was afraid I'd be blamed, or worse, that no one would believe me. Pastor Elijah was loved. He was trusted. I was just a quiet boy with no proof. The next night, we were sitting at the dinner table. My mom was talking about something Pastor Elijah had said during the sermon, glowing with admiration. My father barely touched his food. He kept glancing at me. I think he knew something was wrong, even if I hadn't said it out loud. Eventually, I said it. I told him I didn't want to be alone with Pastor Elijah anymore. That was it. No details. Just that one line. My mother asked why, surprised and confused. But my father didn't say a word. He didn't press me, didn't push. He just looked at me, deeply, and nodded once. Then he stood up from the table and walked out the door. I sat frozen. My mother called after him, confused, but he didn't answer. He got in his truck and drove off into the night. I didn't know where he went. I didn't know what he was thinking. I just knew something had shifted. The silence that had lived in our house for months cracked open that evening, and something powerful stepped through. He came back hours later. His face was different, harder, more focused. He didn't speak to either of us. He went straight to his room and closed the door. The next morning, he knocked on my bedroom door before the sun was up. He had something in his hand. A small device, black, barely bigger than a matchbox, a hidden camera. He told me to wear it the next Sunday. I didn't ask questions. I didn't cry. I just took it. I understood. Sunday came too quickly. I held that little device in my palm all morning like it might burn through my skin. It was nothing more than a camera, hidden inside the front button of my dress shirt. But to me, it felt like armor. Like maybe, just maybe someone would finally see what I couldn't explain. My father didn't say much that morning. He just handed me the shirt with a careful look and told me not to be afraid. But I was. I was terrified. I remember sitting through service that day, every word Pastor Elijah spoke landing differently. His voice, which once felt powerful, now felt manipulative. Every smile, every glance, every exaggerated gesture suddenly looked like theater. I wondered how many others had felt what I felt. How many others were still silent? How many others never made it out? After the sermon, I stayed behind like I always did. Pastor Elijah asked if I could help him organize some things in his office. I nodded, careful not to seem too eager, not to show the storm that was building inside my chest. My mother smiled as I followed him. My father watched from a distance, jaw clenched, knuckles white around the church bulletin in his hands. The door closed behind us with that same soft click. Inside, he turned down the lamp just like before. Dim, quiet. A room meant for secrets. He told me how proud he was of me, how mature I was becoming. He said God had brought me into his life for a reason. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel his breath. His hand rested on my shoulder again. Then it slid downward. This time, I didn't freeze. I kept my head down, silent, letting the camera see what my mouth still couldn't say. I wanted to scream, to run, to break every stained glass window in that church. But instead, I stood still, heart thudding so loudly it felt like thunder. He didn't know. He couldn't have known. He kept talking, kept touching. And then, finally, it ended. He told me to pray on it and sent me back out into the light of the sanctuary like nothing had happened. I walked out with shaking legs and a dry throat. My father was waiting outside the church. His face was pale. He didn't say a word. Just placed his hand gently on the back of my neck and guided me to the truck. We didn't go home. We drove across town, past the gas stations and broken fences, until we reached the house of one of my father's old friends, a man who worked in security systems for local businesses. My father trusted him. I didn't know the man well, but he greeted us quietly and pulled us into his garage. There, in the dim glow of a hanging bulb, we watched the footage. It was all there. Every movement, every word, every moment I wished had never happened, captured clearly. I couldn't look away. My stomach turned, and I thought I might vomit. But I stayed, because my father stayed. He watched every second with a face like stone. He didn't speak, but I saw the change in his eyes. Something broke inside him that night. Something deep. Something final. We made copies. 3 of them. One went in a locked box. Another was handed to the man who'd helped us. And the last went into my father's coat pocket. I thought that was it. I thought the truth would be enough. But I didn't know how dirty the world could be. I didn't understand that power protects power. That a man in a pulpit is harder to destroy than a man with calloused hands and a quiet voice. That was the last Sunday I ever saw Pastor Elijah walk free, because 3 nights later everything changed. I didn't know what my father was planning. He became quieter in the days after we watched the footage. Not cold, just focused. He moved like a man with a mission, like something inside him had settled into place. My mother thought he was just shaken. She didn't know about the camera. She didn't know what he'd seen. I think part of him didn't want to burden her with the truth. Maybe he knew she wouldn't be able to carry it. Or maybe he knew she wouldn't believe it if it came from him. That week passed like a blur. I went to school, ate dinner, pretended to sleep. My father stopped going to work. He was home, always watching, always writing things down, always planning, something I didn't understand. He didn't speak much to me, but he would check in, make sure I was okay, ask if I'd had any bad dreams. There was a tenderness in his silence, but it was covered in something sharp. Rage, maybe, grief, both. Then one night I woke up to the sound of the front door closing. It was around 3 a.m. The house was dark, and I knew right away it was him. I looked out my bedroom window and saw the truck pulling away from the curb. No headlights, just the deep hum of the engine disappearing into the night. He never came home. The call came early the next morning. My mother dropped the phone when she heard. She fell to the floor, screaming his name. I stood frozen in the kitchen, still holding my cereal spoon, as the reality sank in. He had gone to the church. He had waited outside in the dark, and when Pastor Elijah arrived just before dawn, unlocking the front doors like he did every weekday morning, my father stepped out of the shadows. There was no struggle, no screaming, no confrontation in front of witnesses. He shot him twice, right there in the church parking lot. They said Pastor Elijah died instantly. They said my father didn't resist arrest. They said he didn't say a word. By the time I got to the station, it was too late. He had already been booked. They wouldn't let me see him. They wouldn't let my mother speak to him either. The news had spread by afternoon. The headline read, "Local Father Kills. Beloved Pastor in Cold Blood." The media painted him as unstable, angry, dangerous, and no one, not one person, mentioned me. No one asked why he might have done it. The footage? Gone. All 3 copies. The one in our house had disappeared. The one his friend kept, stolen during a so-called break-in the very next day. And the copy he carried in his coat pocket? No trace. The police said they found nothing on him. No memory cards. No evidence. Nothing. I didn't understand. I was just a boy. I thought proof would be enough. I thought truth could stand on its own. But I was wrong. When power is threatened, it buries anything that risks exposure. Pastor Elijah had connections, friends in high places, people with money, people who didn't want to believe what he was. At the trial, my father pled not guilty. But without the footage, there was only one story the jury heard. The story of a violent man who murdered a pastor in cold blood without reason. His lawyer hinted that there may have been abuse, but without physical evidence, it was dismissed. As a desperate excuse, they sentenced him to life, no parole. He looked at me once before they took him away, just once, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes. It wasn't fear, it wasn't regret, it was peace, like he'd done what he had to do, like he'd protected me the only way the world would allow him to. The weeks after the trial felt like I was living in someone else's life. People at school stopped talking to me. Some whispered when I walked by, others just looked away. Parents didn't want their kids around me anymore, as if whatever had happened between me and Pastor Elijah might be contagious, as if my father's rage could rub off on me. Even the teachers changed. I became the boy whose dad killed the pastor. Nothing more. My mother barely left the house. She stopped going to church, stopped answering calls. She drifted through each day like a ghost, her eyes hollow, her voice thin. At night, I could hear her crying through the walls, quiet sobs, like she didn't want to wake me, but loud enough to keep me from sleeping. I think she hated him for what he did. I think she loved him more for it. And that tore her in two. I stopped trying to talk about what really happened. What was the point? The proof was gone. The people who mattered didn't want to hear it. The church held a massive memorial for Pastor Elijah. They called him a shepherd of souls, a man of God. I watched it on TV, numb as people cried and prayed, and held up photos of a man I knew wasn't what he seemed. Some of those same people had warned their own kids not to be alone with him. But in death, all was forgiven. All was forgotten. That was the moment I realized the truth didn't matter to the world. It mattered to me and to my father. But to everyone else, it was just noise, just scandal, just something easier to bury than confront. The system had chosen its villain, my father, and so I carried it. Alone, I still visited him when I could. The first time I saw him in prison, I was scared I wouldn't recognize him. But he looked the same. Older, maybe, tired, but not broken. He smiled when he saw me, and for a second, I was just his son again. We didn't talk about the trial, or Elijah, or the missing footage. We just talked about school, about Mom, about the weather. But I saw it in his eyes. He knew I hadn't let it go. He knew I was still holding the truth. One day, as we sat across from each other at the visitation table, he leaned in and told me to be careful. He said there were people who didn't want the story to live, people who had worked hard to erase it. And if I went digging, I had to be ready for what I might find. I didn't understand then. Not fully, but I remembered every word. After that visit, something shifted in me. I stopped being afraid of the truth. I started writing, journaling, documenting everything I remembered, every conversation, every touch, every red flag. I went back to old sermons, old church newsletters, community records, There were gaps, discrepancies, patterns, rumors no one wanted to confirm, but no one quite denied either. And behind every piece of silence was the same fear, the fear of being the next to speak. I realized that my father hadn't just protected me from Elijah. He'd taken on the silence of a whole community. He'd done what no one else was willing to do. And now that he was behind bars, they thought the story had ended. But I knew it hadn't, and I wasn't done yet. Years have passed since the day they took my father away, but the weight of that moment never left me. I grew older, but some parts of me stayed the same. The silence, the questions, the ache. I kept moving forward, but always with the memory of him beside me, not just as my father, but as the man who gave up everything to protect me from something the world refused to see. I went to college, studied criminal justice, then journalism. I told myself it was to understand the system, to understand how someone like my father could be buried alive by it. But truthfully, I think I just wanted the tools to dig him out. Not long ago, I filed my first official records request for the case. I reviewed court documents, police logs, interviews. Some were redacted, others incomplete. But even through the gaps, I saw the same pattern I'd come to expect. Every trace of the surveillance footage was gone, not just lost, erased, like it had never existed. But I hadn't forgotten, and I hadn't been the only one who saw it. One night, I tracked down an old technician who used to volunteer at the church. He was older now, bitter, sick. But when I told him who I was, he looked at me for a long time, then nodded. He remembered the cameras. He remembered the setup, and most of all, he remembered being told to stay out of it when the tapes went missing. He never said who gave that order. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he was still afraid. Still, it gave me something I hadn't had in years. A thread. So I followed it. Piece by piece, the truth began to reveal itself. Quiet stories from other boys, now men, who'd buried what happened to them too. Families who'd moved away, others who'd gone silent under pressure. And one by one, the image of Pastor Elijah that the world had built up began to fracture. I started writing the story, not just for myself, not just for my father, but for everyone who'd been made invisible. I didn't know if anyone would listen. I didn't know if it would change anything, but I knew I had to speak. I remember the first time I visited my father after the article was published. He was sitting in the visitor's room, the same place we'd met so many times before. But something was different. He looked at me like I had brought him fresh air, like the walls didn't press so tightly anymore. He said he was proud. That was all. I still don't know if the system will ever reopen his case. I don't know if justice, as the world defines it, will ever be possible for him. But I do know this. He wasn't a murderer. He was a father. And while the world tried to forget what was done to me, he never could. He didn't act out of madness or hate. He acted because no one else would. He stepped into the fire so I wouldn't have to. That's the truth. And no matter how many people try to bury it, erase it, rewrite it, I'll keep telling it, because silence is where monsters thrive, and I refuse to be silent anymore.